Everybody. So we are just going to let everyone trickle in a little bit. So we'll get started in about a minute or so. All right. Well, I think we can get started. Introduce myself. My name is Eric Thompson, CFP here at Secfi Wealth. Thank you so much for joining us today, and congrats on the tender offer. Very exciting time for Gusto and for all its employees. Great tech, something that we use here at Secfi and love and appreciate. Well, one thing that we wanted to note is, this has been coming with a lot of questions from the clients that we work with and folks that are reaching out to us, and a lot of decisions to be made around this event. So given that, we wanted to set up these office hours, answer some questions, things that are top of mind, and really offer an opportunity for you to ask questions and us to answer some of those frequently asked ones that we've been seeing on our side. Further background, Secfi Wealth has been around for a number of years now, working with folks in the startup and tech space, really helping navigate everything from equity planning to investment management and all the financial planning questions and needs that individuals have and are navigating through. Alongside me is John Klingler, and I'll let him introduce himself and what he does here.
Yes, perfect. Thanks, Eric. Hi, everyone. My name is John Klingler, as Eric mentioned. I spend most of my time actually on the Secfi liquidity side of the business. So if you've ever submitted a financing request and we're looking and exploring the non-recourse financing, you'd likely talk to myself or a colleague of mine on that side of the business. So primarily working with companies directly, but also individuals who might be seeking to exercise their stock options, get their taxes, covered, and/or seek some additional liquidity, all in a non-recourse cash advance. We've actually worked with a pretty large number of Gusto folks to help them get ahead of the increasing FMV over the years, start the clock on long-term capital gains ahead of liquidity events like this tender offer and future a potential IPO. So we'll maybe touch more on this later, but we want to definitely focus on some of those questions that folks are kind of coming to Eric and other advisors with around what does it mean to experience this tender offer, how to navigate it, those sorts of things. So one quick note is that you'll see in the upper right-hand side to join the Q&A. So if you want to ask any questions, feel free to take out your phone and get that QR code up, and we'll try to go through those. So as the nature of this kind of lends to, it is an office hours, and so we want to be as informal as we can, but also covering some of those questions that have already been asked of many of Eric's clients, and sort of maybe they cover what you were sort of already thinking. So let's sort of jump in and see some of those kind of questions that Eric has been getting. So just to sort of tee it up, Eric, I do know that you do have several Gusto clients going through the tender process. So starting at a high level, like what are you first educating them on regarding the tender offer? What are those first sort of conversations like?
Yeah, it could be as simple as engaging in what is the tender offer, how does it work, how do I actually participate or non-participate. At the highest level, it'll be a lot of tax-oriented questions. A lot of times in working with an advisor and working with us, it really is a tax play, trying to assess and understand and trying to gain ownership of my shares through my options. If I currently hold equity, what is the tax play here? Is there any way to lower the amount of taxes that I'm going to be paying in order to strategize what the exercises over a period of time, in order to offset the gains associated with it, with potential losses elsewhere in my portfolio? All these questions are definitely top of mind in ways that we try to think and navigate. How else? Definitely try to align liquidity with long-term goals, having the conversation of what are people trying to do and maximize over their lives, over their careers, and trying to understand how does a liquidity event like this play into those goals? How could we try to optimize for that? And also, some of the nuances, noting that, a lot of folks, as tender offers come up, they start really thinking more in depth about their equity. Should they exercise more? Should they sell some? Really diving into some of the nuances that are involved there. And I'm sure we'll be touching on it at greater length today.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you brought up a few different points that I think we should, double click on. So one of them, tax considerations that you brought up, like that's often kind of the forefront of people's minds of, okay, I'm going to enter this tender offer. What are the implications to me? One of them I think is also, what should I participate? I have different types of equity. What should I participate in this tender offer? So, for those clients that you've been, guiding along the participation, what are some of those tax considerations you're making them aware of? And I guess the follow-up on that would be, does it matter across whether they have shares, ISOs, or NSOs? Maybe just starting kind of at a high level there.
Yeah, it's great points. And yes, definitely been a common question that's been coming across. To the extent that, we can think from a tax picture and tax perspective, obviously the goal is to try and downshift and reduce tax as much as possible. Highest element going to be income taxes. Next down is going to be AMT in some cases, and then going down to something like capital gains taxes, which are going to be a bit less. And trying to navigate that and strategize of how do we really work down that ladder and down that spectrum to gain maximum benefit while paying the lowest potential taxes over a long time horizon. So things to keep in mind as it relates to this tender offer, if you have a disqualifying disposition of ISOs, if you have qualified stock NSOs, if you have RSUs, those are all going to be income tax elements to really make note of and pay attention to, and ensure that you're doing proper withholdings where feasible, or at least setting aside cash from this liquidity event to cover those eventual taxes. Other things to keep in mind: if you've been holding on to shares for any significant period of time, whether it be less than a year, there's going to be capital gains, likely short-term capital gains in that case. If you've been holding on shares for an extended period of time beyond 1 year, long-term capital gains, really that ideal scenario where you've owned your shares and really subject to the lowest tax burden expected. So that's something that will come into play and that we're talking through often.
Mm-hmm.
And then lastly, for those that have exercised their incentive stock options, it is likely that they may have paid AMT at some point in the past. So as they start gaining liquidity, as they start selling those shares, there's a very good chance they could get AMT credits back. And that also plays into the calculation.
Mm-hmm.
Going to be highly personalized based off of their income situation, based off of past taxes paid, and based off their total picture. That's also something that we've been having those conversations around from a tax perspective. Again, it can get very nuanced and individualized. So at a high level, how we're thinking about it, but it really will be individualized to each individual situation.
Yeah.
In strategizing and thinking at a high level, you noted, how should people be thinking about this? What should they be potentially selling versus holding? I really like to think about this from a sentiment perspective. If somebody is extremely bullish in the company, it becomes a question of, okay, what would be most advantageous or most beneficial to hold on to long term? And in that sense, I would likely lead to a strategy around potentially cashless exercise options, especially if it's non-qualified stock options. Because again, if you expect the price to rise very significantly at some point in the future, and you're looking for something to sell today, trying to take advantage of a sale in which the spread, the difference between your strike price and the exercise price, as well as the current tender, shrinking that amount as much as possible will reduce the income tax burden that comes from it. Whereas if you have shares held outright, being able to own those and hold those long term, expecting very significant growth in the future, will maximize the overall value and the long term holding of a share that will eventually be taxed by capital gains. So if you're super bullish, again, we'll be looking to try to take advantage of those shares which may be subject to income tax in the near term, and holding on to those which may have capital gains, ensuring that over the long term, you end up with more dollars in your own pocket. But the opposite would also be true, where if you're bearish and you're like, you know what, my sentiment around the company, they're growing fine, but not significantly. What you could do is potentially sell shares today, capture some of that growth that you've had thus far, and then maintain the optionality of your options by keep holding on to those, having some of that leverage without cash out of pocket, and saying, you know what, if this company goes up in the future and exceeds my expectations, then I may have an outlay of cash and take advantage of it. But in the near term, I'm able to gain some liquidity from this tender offer. I'm able to capture some of that value from the shares that I already own. So to answer your question, tends to be fairly sentiment driven. Again, in addition to what their long-term goals are, if they want to build up their cash buffer, utilize cash for other purposes, it really becomes a nuanced question with a lot of variables at play, but one way we're thinking about it.
100%. And that's definitely why folks reach out to experts, because I think the order of priority and making sure they're optimizing for their sentiment and taxes is, crucial. I think that's what people reach out to you and our team all the time with. I guess building off of that, people often come with unique situations where they've maybe worked at the company when they were living in, let's say, like California, for example, and they were, earning and accruing their options there. They maybe exercised some there, but they've since moved. They've, moved, whether it was during COVID or after, whatever it might be. And they're saying, okay, well, what does this mean for my situation? Like, I know that's something that you always kind of come across, people who have unique situations there. What should people consider if they have moved from a perspective of exercise, now liquidity? What does that maybe mean? Obviously there's nuances to each situation, but what is kind of a broad kind of stroke across that topic?
Yeah, good question. Definitely something we touch upon, as people are navigating from their, the common moves of California to Texas, or, New York to Florida being some common ones that we've been seeing pretty often lately. And, we'll think about this in the different terms of would be ISOs versus NSOs here. For ISOs, AMT is calculated at the federal level, but state level may also vary. Those in California would be well aware of this. If you exercise in a high tax state like California or New York and move to a low or no tax state, you have to carefully allocate the income between states. And you have to determine, where the income from the sale versus the AMT paid at exercise was sourced. So there is going to be a lot of nuance here for the timing of when things were granted versus vesting versus when they were sold. It often comes into play that it's not where you work when the options were, or I'm sorry, it is where the options were earned as opposed to when it was sold. So say you lived in California in previous years and have since moved to Texas, because those shares likely vested at some point in California, California is going to deem, okay, that was income that you received while you were in California, even though it has not been sold or recognized yet. So they're going to likely want to, basically push or be a bit aggressive in terms of, claiming that income or the tax associated with it is really due to California. So there's going to be some nuance there. Similarly for non-qualified stock options, most states tax based on where you worked when the options were earned. So it's going to be very similar, not where you live at the time of sale. So again, from this perspective, it's really going to be a sourcing element, diving into where were they earned and inevitably where were they sold, and working with a highly qualified CPA to really parse through some of these nuances to assess, okay, what taxes are due to which states and how is it going to impact you on a personalized basis.
Yep, 100%. Yeah, love that. I think getting a plan in place and incorporating other experts is, I think, obviously the role of a great advisor, but also just what people probably need. They need several experts in their corner to make sure that they're navigating this properly. Back to your point before, even that involves AMT, making someone sure tracking the AMT on the way in, on the way out with the credit, and kind of taking full advantage of everything. But shifting gears just a little bit. So you get questions, I'm sure, from some of your Gusto, clients who have been there for a long time, and obviously the goal of grinding it out for years at a private company, at a startup, is to ultimately, build great products, obviously have great experiences, but hopefully at some point, reach liquidity on your shares and reap the benefits of that hard work. So, this is a big moment for many of your Gusto clients. So, what are some of the financial planning considerations that you speak to clients about when they're reaching some of this long-awaited liquidity? It's through this tender offer. They're able to at least realize some of that. What are some of those conversations around like the planning and things to think about?
Yeah, great question. And, again, as I kind of alluded to earlier, the different three legs of the stool that we, take care of on the wealth side, from equity planning, investment management, and financial planning. On the equity planning aspect, it'll be a function of, okay, what's the optimized strategy here from those options that you've exercised to equity that you currently own? How do we try to maximize the benefit to you individually? Funneling into that are questions around the investment management side, the aspect of, how much concentration or, what type of balance sheet risk are you putting into this one specific company? And are there ways to diversify? Are there ways to have a counterbalance within your portfolio, to try and balance out some of that concentration risk in one company, in one industry? And then on the financial planning side specifically, and really getting to the heart of your question, it really dives into that goal setting that I alluded to earlier, the element of what do these resources mean to you, to your family? What are you trying to accomplish with them? If you really want a cash buffer, if you're a bit anxious about markets and you're just like, you know what, I've really been meaning to build up that emergency fund and have some funds socked away for whether it be a rainy day or my ability to maybe take a sabbatical or some time off, then maybe having some cash on the side and utilizing a liquidity event like this to build up that cash buffer might be really meaningful. If it's, what, my family, we've been living out of a townhome or apartment for a while, but renting forever, and our top goal is really to settle down, buy a home, and have a stable place for our family, then utilizing these proceeds for that purpose, again, might be top of mind. So this liquidity event really funnels into, turning the equity into intentional outcomes. It's being able to say, okay, we have these resources available to us. How do we make it work for us and our interests and what we really want out of everything? Um, you know, as we try to think about whether the risk that they're taking on, not only from the portfolio, but from a larger perspective, again, concentration risk overall, is trying to balance out all these objectives and trying to make these funds in a tender offer really work in the best interest of that client for their long-term goals.
100%. And yeah, you named like several different things, which are all extremely important. But I imagine to some of your clients can be overwhelming to try to tackle all of these across the board, which is why I'm sure they really value your perspective. The role of a great advisor is letting themselves get out of their own way to help accomplish those particular tasks with that intention that you mentioned. So I think those are like extremely top of mind across the board. And so we touched on this earlier, but of course the tender offer is only for a certain percentage. I think it's up to about 20% for individuals' total holdings. So you mentioned different things around reinvesting or people who are bullish or bearish. What are clients asking you about the other 80% of their equity? It obviously can be in different forms, but I imagine there are people who are debating purchasing more now. What should they consider on that new spread now between now and the fair market value? Other clients may be hoping to access more liquidity than they got. Like, what are conversations looking like for those that saying, okay, I'm participating, but now what do I do with the rest of my gusto equity?
Yeah, certainly. So not to sound like the broken record, but it's the aspect of what are their goals or intentions. If they're super bullish about the company and they're sitting back saying, you know what, I would like to double down. I want to utilize whatever liquidity I have to exercise more and gain that long-term benefit of, trying to exercise additional ISOs, really capture that value internally so I can get the proper holding periods for, capital gains taxation at some point in the future. That optimization has been a key component of conversations. Similarly, a top of mind question is that exercise question. Should I utilize this tender to exercise? And I think a really important nuance, something to really consider and think about, is an aspect that, after tender offers, it is somewhat common, not always, but something to potentially keep in mind, that a future 409A may be slightly lower than today's tender. So if you were to exercise today, there may be a lower 409A in the near future. It's pretty often, and is maybe the case and likely the case for Gusto, in that they are likely going to undergo a revaluation or a new 409A at some point in the coming months. And again, that may be lower than the fair market value that you're experiencing today in the tender. So the question would be, this is likely a reason to sell today, but not a reason to exercise today. There's likely some benefit to come from waiting to exercise when that 409A is revalued and utilizing that value at some point in the future to gain additional ownership of your shares. So a strategy or play here might be, selling some of the equity or shares that you own outright, holding on to that liquidity again until that new 409A is established, and then working through that process to exercise then. But yes, as you noted, this is really just a small portion. It's a good thing to plan around. It's good to assess on an individual side to say, okay, this is just a small piece of the puzzle. And for those that are looking to gain additional ownership of their equity, those that are saying, you know what, the cash in hand, it's nice, but it's just a small drop in the bucket for my total equity position. There's a lot of tools in the toolbox, of which the non-recourse funding that we offer here is one of those options, one of those tools in the toolbox. So I'll actually throw it back to you if you don't mind sharing a little bit about, what you guys are doing, how you've maybe helped some Gusto employees in the past, and how you guys are thinking about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you mentioned, it is just a tool in the toolkit for advisors, like yourself to kind of explore. And so if it does make sense for certain situations, it can be for a variety of reasons. Well, it could be, offsetting some risk where an individual has maybe already, exercised a bunch and is kind of already at max, capacity on what they've done on their own. And they're saying, well, I still see a lot of the advantages from maybe a tax perspective to exercise now, capture that spread like you talked about between their strike price and that fair market value, be able to then also start the clock on long-term capital gains for whatever this new set of shares is, of course, trying to, minimize that tax impact, whether it's ISOs or NSOs, hopefully benefit from those two sort of, tax wins. And ultimately, of course, financing on the non-recourse side, it's not free. There are fees involved, et cetera. But hopefully if things go well for the company, those are offset by those tax savings at the end. And so we've worked with a really good handful of clients over the years. So you can think of an individual who maybe exercised a couple of years ago and now is reaching, a liquidity event via the tender, and is able to actually benefit from participating, having many of their shares at this long-term capital gains rate, kind of all of those benefits that we discussed, and also other reasons as well. Maybe through the tender offer, liquidity accessed through it wasn't enough for whatever the overarching goals are to, again, the broader, financial picture on goals of the individual. And there needs to be additional liquidity for a home purchase or whatever the sort of, planning needs are. Well, this could also be a way to explore that on that side of things. Again, just a tool in the toolkit of, ways to look at a broader sort of, a broader picture, but it certainly can have its place at certain the right times, right place for individuals. So that's certainly something that, we speak to people about.
Perfect.
And I guess, on that note of, maybe kind of one of the last questions that we can check and see if there's any questions in the Q&A, but, you touched on it earlier, and on the note of, okay, participating, buying more, potentially offsetting risk in different ways, how do you view, concentration risk in general of an individual who has their balance sheet, so their, equity and their net worth and the shares they own and the options that they have, plus their salary tied to one company? How do you, handle those questions from clients who might be concerned about those things? What are the sort of, ways that you kind of navigate that with folks?
Yeah, the way I like to think about this is sometimes we become so tunnel visioned to a company that we've been working for a long time, that we're extremely comfortable with. We understand, business lines. We have a line into management, and we have some communication there, and we have a lot of comfort with the company that we work for. But if I was to reposition it and say, if you had that much balance sheet exposure and personal exposure to any other company that exists out there, maybe not one of like the big tech companies that are pretty reliable and a large source of, stability in our stock market, but think about some other small cap or mid cap company out there, and you had your entire balance sheet reliant on that one company, you would give an understanding, an objective approach to say, yeah, that company could go through some ebbs and flows. There could be, significant business disruptions or something that might affect that company. So from that perspective and trying to stay objective, and trying to stay a little external to it, it's really assessing, do you think that it's prudent to maintain that much concentration and that much belief in this company? Some folks, again, want to double down. They really like that concentration exposure. They're seeing this as their ticket, their one way to significant wealth. But we really like to encourage thoughtful diversification over time to try and assess the risk of having all that concentration on their, again, personal balance sheet, and trying to say, okay, how do we mitigate some of that risk in a situation like this, for a tender offer? It might be saying, okay, let's take a little bit off the table. Let's take some chips off the table and put it into a well-diversified portfolio that, tries to balance or mitigate some of the risk of so much concentration in a tech company, in startup, in the private world, and, gear it more towards, differentiated or some different type of public companies, and trying to balance that exposure again on the balance sheet. It might be taking into considerations of, how do I just reduce my risk overall? Some folks that we talk to, and they may be at a different company at this point, or have transitioned some element of their lives where they maybe not totally reliant on this one company. Then we have some other and differing conversations for, again, are you working at a company that's very similar, maybe in the same field? Again, trying to reduce having so many eggs in one basket of this type of company and this type of industry and this type of market environment, and trying to assess, okay, if something were to go wrong, if we start to see any volatility or disruption there, how do we try to mitigate that in the client's best interest and try to offset that, again, whether it be through, elements within their investment portfolio to different financial planning techniques and tools that we can leverage.
Perfect. I was checking the chat. I don't see many questions there, and I know we're coming up on the 30-minute mark here anyway for the office hours. So, I figured people probably have specific questions that they might have and not want to put into sometimes a chat, because it's very nuanced. As you said, everything that we kind of covered today, it's hopefully helpful to talk about at the different strategies, different high levels. But when it comes down to each individual's situation, it is very specific to your tax rate, where you file, how you file, the equity that you hold, all these different things that are very specific to
Certainly.
one individual versus another. So if anyone does have, the desire to chat with you a bit more specifically about their situation, like what's the best way to get in touch with you, Eric, specifically, Secfi Wealth? Like how can someone, best approach it?
Yeah, good question. And, I would probably navigate them towards the Secfi website, being able to set up an intro call with either myself or some of the other advisors that we have here. That'd probably be my first point of contact, your ability to set up an account there and, work directly with us and reach out to us directly from there. Probably the best place to navigate. I know we have a bunch of resources on there as well. So if I didn't answer a question here, I know we recently put out some resources to Gusto employees, whether it be through our LinkedIn as well as our website. So you can feel free to navigate from there as well. But for those individualized questions that may be really nuanced, or you really want a perspective of how should you handle it particularly, I would definitely navigate to secfi.com and then work your way to the wealth management tab after creating an account, and you can set up an intro call from us through there. And a similar notion, you definitely brought up the financing aspect earlier. Would it be similar to try and get in touch with you?
Yep, exactly. Like I mentioned, if people have questions on that, you go straight to the Secfi website, and you'll actually be able to schedule directly on my calendar there. So that should be pretty streamlined, and happy to chat with anyone who wanted to kind of learn a bit more. So yeah, I think that maybe, Eric, unless you have anything else on your end, I think that might cover it from office hours perspective. But I'm checking the chat one more time just to see if there's any more questions. No, I don't see any more on this side, Eric.
Perfect. Yeah, I think we are all set. Again, glad to provide this kind of high-level overview, how we're thinking about this tender, how you can potentially consider it for yourself. Definitely a nuanced conversation. So, hopefully you may be able to take advantage of this tender offer as it pertains to how to think about it on a going forward basis. As I alluded, if there's changes to the 409A, the potentially exercise in the near future, some of those equity planning considerations that you can kind of dive into and pre-plan for the future, that really is our bread and butter and what we dive into here. So again, even if this specific tender may not be bypassed or you already made your decision here, when there's plenty to be done in the future, that's where we can step in. So definitely don't hesitate to reach out to either myself or John with your questions. But yeah, if there's no other questions, we can close out for today.
Perfect. Thanks, Eric. Thanks for your time.
Yeah, thanks so much, John.